Alex Guns, the fund manager of the Heptagon Future Trends equity fund, and I'm here today to talk to you about the case for smart grids. So we read the word smart an awful lot when we're thinking about technology, and generally the way to frame it is really to think of smart as being transformative. It's taking something which is analog and making it digital using technology. And with regard to grids, there is an absolutely huge opportunity. The idea is effectively to provide real-time monitoring where power is going and where it is being used. And the idea is that with a smart grid, you would effectively be deploying technology throughout the network, whether it's the power transmission lines or actually electric appliances in a user's household. There are two main reasons why we need smart grids. The first is that if you think about the existing grid infrastructure that we have around the world, it's incredibly old and antiquated. Most of it was built around the time of the Second World War ending. It was only conceived as having a meaningful life of 50 to 60 years, and as a result of its aging, what you're seeing is increased wear and tear on the grid network. When you have extreme weather events like hurricanes or the very warm weather we experienced in Europe in the summer, that can put a lot of pressure on the grid network. Also, because the grid network is old, it may potentially be subject to cybersecurity breaches. Many listeners will be familiar with the Colonial Pipeline event last year. That's just one example of how infrastructure like this could be compromised. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is simply that global energy demand is going up. If you take most conventional forecasts, we're looking at something like a 50% increase in global energy needs between 2020 and 2050. And really what's driving this is not just population growth and urbanization, but simply as the world is becoming digital or smarter in a more general sense of the word, we're connecting more and more things into networks, more Internet of Things, more digital twin factories. All of that is putting pressure on existing infrastructure. I would characterize the benefits of smart grids as really being fourfold. Number one would be reliability, and this is simply the idea that because a smart grid is new, it will work much better, more efficiently than a previous or older grid network. The second, which follows on from that really, is efficiency. Things like load balancing, so managing peak demand, for example, that can be done much better in a smart grid. The third would be flexibility. At the moment, in conventional grid systems, you as a user cannot send power back into the grid. The whole idea is that with a smart grid, if you happen, say, to have solar panels on the top of your house, you can become a generator of electricity as well as a user of it. So flexibility means power going both ways. And then finally, point four, and feeding on from the prior point, is this whole idea of sustainability. For the first time properly in a world of smart grids, there's going to be an actual place for renewable energy to play a meaningful role in grid infrastructure. One final observation I'd make is that really when we think about smart grids or digitally empowering, if you will, electricity networks, this, to my mind, is very much the beginning. In the future, what you could consider is having drones, for example, monitoring remotely parts of the grid network. You could have increased automation in terms of fault monitoring, and you could also have increased automation in terms of a lot of the back-end services within a grid network. I can think of a number of examples of smart grid deployment around the world. Certainly the first and most obvious one that springs to mind would actually be a project pioneered in Europe about 15 years ago by the Italian utility Enel. They launched something called the Telegestore project, which was effectively a smart grid built from bottom up. And it's actually been a remarkable success story. Even today, it's still generating about 500 million euros annually in terms of cost savings relative to what would have occurred without it. Beyond that, there are probably something in the order of 15 full deployments around the world, and certainly if you look within the EU, there's something in the order of maybe 500 smaller projects underway, often trying to link together different bits of electricity network or allowing across the continent for adjacent countries some sort of power sharing. It's not just Europe though. If you think about the US, whilst they are perhaps a relative laggard, certainly the deployment of smart meters in the US has actually become more and more prevalent. About 100 million homes in the US now have smart electricity meters, and certainly if President Biden's infrastructure bill gets approval, we should expect to see more smart grid deployments across the states. I think you need to think of a microgrid as being part of the infrastructure that fits across a broader smart grid network. For people who aren't aware what a microgrid is, it's simply an autonomous, self-functioning power unit. So if you imagine, for example, say a remote farm or a community, then actually it is the idea of them having constructed their own independent power supply. This can actually be very, very beneficial, particularly in the event of, say, adverse weather conditions where part of a grid infrastructure might get knocked out, if you're particularly concerned, say, about terrorist threats. And increasingly what we are seeing, particularly in emerging markets, is the idea that simply, rather than actually trying to build out a very complex, very extensive grid network, which takes time, costs money, actually deploying microgrids in the locations where energy is specifically needed can have an awful lot of benefits. I think all of the technology and the underlying tools, if you will, that are required to build smart grids or for smart grids to be practically functioning exists today. So the issue is not in that respect. The challenge is much more getting buy-in from the appropriate parties. One of the topics that came up in many of the conversations we had when doing our research on this topic is that typically when you talk to grid operators or listed utility companies, if you will, there is quite a lot of intransigence in this respect. There's a reluctance to take risks. These projects obviously cost money, and as everyone is aware, we're in a more straitened, constrained financial environment at the moment. There's also the issue of regulators fully buying into this, even if the efficiency benefits, as we outlined, are very clear. And then clearly there needs to be comfort around the topic of cybersecurity and concerns about compromise. I think the other key takeaway I'm very keen to share is that certainly in all of the discussions we have had on this topic, the idea of actually doing something in as full and complete a fashion as possible really matters. The incorrect way forward is not implementing smart grid infrastructure on a piecemeal basis. There's an absolutely huge opportunity in smart grids. If you look at the numbers today, and obviously consultant report assumptions will vary depending on exactly how you define the size and the scope of the market, but the smart grid market, broadly speaking, is worth about $150 billion today, and based on the growth rates that are generally projected, it could be 4 times or up to 4 times that size by the end of this decade. That's great, but the challenge, of course, is how one invests in it practically. And certainly from the work that we've done, it's still not entirely evident exactly where the value accrues. In other words, will it be to listed utility businesses? Will it be to businesses providing critical infrastructure, whether it's the hardware or indeed the software? Certainly what we would see, looking from a sort of top-down perspective, is that some of the obvious names that play in this space already, businesses like ABB, GE, Siemens, for example, should be well placed to benefit from what's going on. Another perspective that I think it's important to share is that when you're trying to look for listed pure play businesses, these to our mind are very few and far between. A couple of names that might spring to mind would be a Dutch listed business called Alfen, which provides grid infrastructure and smart meters for charging electric vehicles. There's a Swiss business called Landis & Gyr, which does smart grid software. and also just trying to think a bit more broadly. A business like Xylem, US listed company, has developed a very strong position in smart metering, albeit more for the water industry rather than specifically the electricity industry. All of this said, clearly, given the growth potential ahead, we have every confidence that going forward there will be more opportunities for investors to get exposure to this space. So thank you everyone for taking the time to listen. As a reminder, my name's Alex Guns, the fund manager of the Heptagon Future Trends Equity Fund. Our full piece all about smart grids is available on Heptagon Capital's website. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out either to me or to your representative at Heptagon Capital. Thank you.